Good afternoon and welcome to the SEDAR's Navigating the Blizzard series of webinars. Thank you for participating. Thank you for signing up. Thank you for joining. I think you would agree that we are going through some unprecedented times, and that's the purpose of today, is to really start the conversation, start the thinking, equip you to think through some of the things with some of the knowledge that we have. My name is Roger Hitchcock. I'm a senior partner at SEDAR, and we're privileged to be in a position to be able to provide what we hope is some valuable insights and answers over this series. The whole concept of this series of webinars, and we will be running them as you would have seen when you registered. We aim to run them 3 times a week: Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We've mixed up the times of day because we do operate in different countries across Africa in different time zones. And there will be times when we'll address concepts maybe more specific to one context than the other. But the idea is that, as we've put there, that as this blizzard engulfs the whole globe, and I'm sure that you are probably doing some of what I'm doing, is, monitoring the numbers, asking the question, what do we do? Going through not only challenges on the business front, but the personal front. We all aren't only involved in business. We also have families, we have friends, we have parents, we have children. And part of the process is we want to really help you address some of these things. So it's about maintaining a clear head, addressing the right issues in the right way. It's also a lot of the work that we've had the privilege of doing has been in the boardroom. And so the context and the audience we are talking to through this series of seminars, webinars, is going to be decision makers. We want to think about it in terms of what are the next steps to take, because the challenge of a blizzard, and that's why we chose this metaphor, is that 2 things. We do believe that it is coming to pass, and some of the foundational concepts I'm going to talk through today are how do we deal with things that, in some senses, we know the intensity will change over time, but in another sense, what a blizzard tends to do is it does leave behind an impact, and some of the impact will be significant, some of the impact will be permanent, some of the impact will be transient. And so we're watching in exactly the same way as you. We're in the middle of the blizzard, but if those of you who know the SEDAR thinking and positioning, is the name SEDAR comes from the lead Sherpa in a mountain expedition. And so part of this is also stepping forward and saying, we have had the privilege of being in lots of boardrooms. We have had the privilege of helping companies navigate a range of different challenges and obstacles. And so we're offering you the opportunity to listen, to take what we've got to offer and to apply it, because we're going to try to keep this series as practical as possible during this whole process. And so it's about thinking through the implications, the impact of these steps, take the decisions you have to take in a responsible but effective way, and essentially to position yourselves to see this thing through. And what we mean by position yourselves is obviously on the various fronts that we are involved. I know that some of you may be listening from, most of you are listening, we trust, from a business perspective, and that's the perspective we're taking. Some of you are thinking through things on an individual perspective. To give a little bit of background, we're all going through things, but where I'm coming from, in the last week, I've had everything from having to think through a son who had traveled recently to Europe, and providing him with advice, insight, and some fairly straightforward instructions. Halfway through in South Africa, we had an announcement by our president on Sunday evening, and halfway through that announcement, I sent a message to my son saying, please book, I don't even think I used the word please, but book the next flight out of there, because rather here than there. And here's back at home in Cape Town where he lives. I live in Pretoria, but he's self-isolating. We also have, issues in the business. SEDAR is going through exactly the same questions that you're going through. What are we going to do going forward? So that's the foundation. That's where we're coming from and where I'm coming from. And what we want to do in this webinar is to really unpack, and I'm going to go through what I believe are some key foundational concepts to help us frame what we're going through and frame what some of our thinking should be in the time ahead. I'm also going to give some opinion, and again, that is essentially some opinion on what I anticipate and what we as a team anticipate the way forward or ahead to look like. And again, I frame that because it's very, very difficult to form some steady, and none of us have the crystal ball to see what this thing will look like. But I think we all need to begin trying to imagine what the way ahead would look like, and understand that in terms of looking at the signs in the present. And then the last part of the webinar is to be saying, well, how do we practically make sense of what we're going through? And so we've put some thinking together in terms of some practical processes we can help our clients go through, and we also want to provide that as a process going forward. As we go through the webinar, please engage. There is the Q&A box that I have open in front of me. There is also the chat box. I'm going to see and try as we go to address the questions and the comments as they come up. Another sense of positioning is to understand what we believe about boardroom performance and why we focus on the boardroom, and we believe in leveraging boardroom performance. The performance of a company is heavily dependent on what happens in the boardroom. And by boardroom, I mean governance related thinking that encapsulates and carries the liability and the responsibility for the business. The big decisions are initiated or rest in the boardroom. And one of the challenges I think we've got to all do is what I call begin with the end in mind, and have a picture of what we're aiming to achieve. And we put that in this way. Leveraging boardroom performances. They're a critical, and part of the conversations today and over this series of webinars may be talking to you as a director or a decision maker or a governor in your business. And we're all being challenged in terms of our roles and positions and relationships. And that's the context we believe a director works in. But the key context is the team in the boardroom, the pivot upon which the lever sits. And it's thinking about, and some of the challenges and questions we have to ask ourselves are, who do we have in the boardroom, and do we have the right governance structures to handle what we're going through? And some of the foundational thinking, I believe, will talk to some of that. It's then important to apply the principles of governance. It's very easy in a crisis to drop everything and become irrational and unreasonable. We've seen that in some of the news flows, some of the responses, and unfortunately in some of the countries that are being hit by this crisis that is unfolding, the blizzard that is unfolding around the globe. We've seen countries and companies react too late. I believe in Africa, what we've seen is a fairly early response. I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic, but I do understand that it's going to be challenging. And in our boardrooms, we need to be having conversations as soon as possible, if you haven't started already. Because ultimately it is the director on the board applying the principles of governance that leads to an effective, accountable and sustainable business. And right now the challenge is going to be sustainability. We do that by ensuring accountability for actions, because part of the process is making sure that everybody has a clear idea of what to do, and ultimately understanding and thinking about what will an effective company look like into the future. And perhaps to start, a good place to think about is to say, well, what do we think is going to lie ahead? Anticipating what lies ahead in terms of timeframes. And having done a lot of work with organizations, and especially thinking about supply chains, my mind has dwelt on it and thought about what can we think about in terms of timeframes. And in a sense, this is some of my opinions, but I think that what we're going to see is some of the following. And excuse my scribbles, but those of you who know me know that I can't talk without drawing or writing. If we think about a time frame and a timeline going forward, into the future, we've got to think about, I think, from the present here, which is where chaos is happening. We've got to think about, I think, the next 3 months, the next 6 months, the next 12 months and beyond. In the next 3 months, it is going to be serious crisis management. It's going to be crazy, and we're going to see a lot of externally imposed things. We're going to see decisions made, and we're going to have to make decisions that are really, really challenging. Those decisions, however, need to be taken with at least a 12-year view on them. In the short term, the danger is we're going to get lost in the short term, and we're going to lose a lot of focus. If we can think about what the business will look like, and this is where in a crisis, strategically, what tends to happen is that the time horizon is shortened. I think the danger is we shorten it to the immediate instead of keeping a picture in mind of what through looks like. And I'll touch on that in a few minutes' time. What I mean by the bullwhip phenomenon, so in supply chain thinking, there is this concept of what's called the bullwhip. And what the bullwhip means is that a small disruption tends to grow over time. And it's called a bullwhip because that's what tends to happen when you have a whip that you use. And the challenge is that a disruption in the short term has a long-term effect. And part of thinking through what we're going to be going through in 12 months' time is to ask the question, what is the nature of the disruption happening right now in our businesses? And some of you, it's going to be absolutely severe, but some of you, it's going to be mitigatable, if there's such a word, by doing the right thing. And so, as I said, we want to spend some time today asking the question, how do we think through this whole concept? And the danger is, I think, from a third concept I want to kind of put in the middle, is that if we think about the danger is we're going to start seeing and have started to see a decline. And within this, and I think this period here, this 3 to 6 month period, is going to be a period where we start seeing the declines compounding. And the effect in the short term is going to be tough, but I think the main effect, especially if we don't do something in the short term, is going to be in the 3 to 6 months ahead. Those of you who've been following the news would have seen the concept, and a lot of this is built upon the concept of what's called flattening the curve. And the main reason, just to draw it, is that we are seeing incredibly restrictive actions being taken, is that if we don't, we're going to see a spike in cases, and this spike is going to overwhelm our systems and our processes, our healthcare systems. And that's what China managed. What China did in this space is they added hospitals. Most of our countries can't do that. Italy is going through this spike. And so the idea of the restrictions, and it applies in our businesses as well, is we want to try to flatten the curve. And the assumption there is not necessarily that there'll be less people overall infected, but it tries to keep the infection rate under this critical threshold of crisis. And so that's some of the thinking that I think we're all facing and we're all challenged by going forward. With that in mind, I want to touch on two concepts that I think will help us think well through this crisis before I unpack a bit of a process for thinking. And the two concepts, the one is called liminality and the other one is called requisite variety. And these form a foundation for approaching the challenges that we are facing. The word liminality is an interesting one because I believe we are in what would be termed a liminal space. I became aware of this concept by being involved in rites of passage with young adults growing up, and the period of transition of teenagerhood is a liminal space because it is a space we go into, a space we go through, and a space we leave. And the word liminal comes from the Latin word for a threshold or a doorway. And so liminal means transitional, but it's the space of moving through something. Some of the liminal spaces that we experience every day would include stairwells, another liminal space that has become very quiet, and I've been through many times, but not at the moment, are airports. Airports are spaces of to and through and from. And I think that's the credit to have to what we're going through is dawn and dusk. Dawn is a transitional space between night and day, or dusk, day and night. And I think we need to understand that the way we approach it, going through it, and it's not permanent. And I think that's what I'm trying to illustrate here. The other thing is a parking garage. Those of you who've got stuck in a parking garage, as I was a few years ago when my car broke down in a parking garage, and it's a very strange place to be because it's not a final space, it's a transitional space. And obviously this concept of a blizzard is one where we're thinking through things. And obviously the reason we shorten our horizon is because we can't really see that far. And so we look as far as we can look. And we look as far as we can look based on what we know about the past, but what we've already anticipated about the future. So those of you who've already had a strategic view of where you think you're going will find it possibly there'll be more handles to think about. And so the whole concept of liminality, as I said, is a concept of thinking to, and I know we're in the midst of a lot of things, but some of us are, some of our countries are in the early stages. I know I'm in South Africa, and we're starting to see the uphill growth curve, and we'll know within the next week the extent to which we expect this to grow going forward, and whether we're on a trajectory similar to the other countries that we've seen, or whether we're not. Some of you are even earlier. The number of cases is smaller, and the problem is when we are approaching something, there's a lot of uncertainty. And so some of our thinking needs to be, what can we do to prepare? And the challenge is the time frame is short. And what I'm suggesting decision makers do is certainly start communicating with one another, start trying to get an understanding of where people are coming from. What we've tried to do as a team in Sadar is start having meetings and preparing for those meetings instead of just coming into a meeting to discuss it, putting some ideas out there before we meet so that we're actually more prepared for the key issues at hand. Our approach will also be determined or be guided by our value system. So the level of priorities that emerge in how we anticipate getting through this thing, because that's the next thing, is going to be dependent a lot on our organizational culture, our values, and how strong our relationships are internally and externally. And so the action and accountability we take, the actions we identify, the people we hold accountable for those actions, and the method that we unpack that in our businesses is going to be quite critical in thinking through. And part of the reason for putting a bit of a timeline out there, and I'm starting to see articles with anything from 3 to 6 months, right through to 1 to 2 years. So depending on who you're reading, and I'm trying to read widely with a fairly objective lens, because I want to see what the scope of thinking is out there, and I'm trying to also find the people who I can trust, who I believe are credible. But I think, and my opinion is that this is certainly going to disrupt the bulk of 2020. And the longer term repercussions will still be felt into the next couple of years. This thing is of such a significance and such a scale, and then from ultimately looking forward to say, when we do exit this thing, what will things look like on the other side? What do we believe will have changed permanently? What do we believe will be able to go back to what we knew in the past as normal? And the reason it's important to start thinking about that is because the decisions you take in the next weeks and months should be aimed at preserving what you think is going to be valuable in the future, and if necessary, cutting off, removing, moving away from things that are not necessarily going to be helpful in the future. And we're all seeing some very encouraging signs of how communities are pulling together, how even you know, where people are isolated, communities are getting around them. And I'm sure we're all part of communities that we hope and trust, if we get isolated, will also get around us. And so the concept of liminality, as we go into the process a bit later, I want you to think about those things. How do we approach this thing? If it hasn't quite hit us as hard as Italy and some of the European countries, how do we prepare ourselves? How do we look ahead to what they've gone through and prepare ourselves? What are the steps we're going to need to take to get through this? It could be identifying who we need to speak to, who do we need to negotiate with, who do we need to actually make sure we communicate regularly and well with, and then what is it going to look like on the other side. So that's the one thinking foundation. The other one is one called the Law of Requisite Variety, because what we're going through right now is going to test everything about us. It's going to test personally our ability to handle change and challenge. I've started to see the interesting videos that people are putting up on day 4, 5, 6, 10 of their isolation. And sure, a lot of it is in jest, and I appreciate the humor, but I think the challenge is going to be that when people are isolated individually, it is going to bring out some challenges personally. It's going to challenge our teams. How do we continue to engage? How do we relate to one another where we are possibly forced to be in different places and only ever communicate as I'm communicating with you online? And how do we learn the skills? How do we connect with one another in that way? And then our businesses and the way our businesses are structured, the things we've relied on, will also change and be challenged. And so this Law of Requisite Variety was promulgated by a gentleman called Ashby in the 1950s, and he was a biologist. He worked with biological systems, and we're seeing the interesting, a virus is a biological system, so it's affecting us. And he spoke about the way in which complex systems operating in changing environments actually are successful and succeed in maintaining the key variables they need to within extreme limits. And so the word variety he used to say, well, variety is how many states a system or an environment can take. And what he means by requisite variety is that he said for a system itself to be stable. And so think of this in terms of, your company. Think of this in terms of the space that you are governing, the space that you are deciding around, all right? For that to be stable, the number of states that its control mechanism, and this speaks to what we believe the role of the board is. So the board is in effect, effectively the control mechanism for the company. And so if the system is to be stable, the control mechanism or the controlling mechanism must be able to attain or to reach or to operate in a greater number of states than the actual system being controlled. And so the challenge to ask is, in your decision-making process, we are going to be tested more than ever before in the next few weeks and months that lie ahead. What is the complexity of our business? And do we need to start asking the question, how do we increase the variety at decision-making level? And maybe that means we need to bring experts into the room, or maybe we need to bring people who are in the business to a higher level of conversation, because most of your businesses have probably got people with untapped, unlocked potential in them. And so how does one think about building variety at decision-making or controlling level that will take into account the system itself? And then the second level is to say that each system, all right, each system operates within an environment, all right, the controlling mechanism. And so if a system is to be able to deal successfully with the diversity of challenges that its environment produces, the blizzard we're going through right now, all right, then the system itself needs to have a repertoire of responses which is at least as nuanced as the problems thrown up by the environment. And so a viable system is one that can handle the variety thrown at it. And right now we're being tested on all kinds of fronts. And there are two ways to handle this challenge of variety that is being thrown at us. The one is to try as far as possible to reduce the variety. And there may be key areas of your business where you need to reduce the variety in the system, because the more complexity you have in the system, potentially the more fragility it will have. And so systematizing certain areas of the business, and this could be as simple, and remember, this could be something that is done in the short term. I've already started to see some of the protocols that businesses are writing. I've had exposure to a number of those where people have said, well, this is what we've thought about. How does it look? And in the short term, we're going to have to put some systems in place, policies in place that are designed to handle the short term. Things like sanitizing, separation, how do we communicate, and some of that will challenge our organizational culture because we want to meet in groups and maybe we can't. Some of it will challenge the way that we deal with our customers, because we have to look at how our customers interact and relate to us, or our suppliers. But we have to see what we can systematize in this current environment, even if it is for the short term. But at the same time, one needs to increase the variety, and that's where we need to up our ability to handle the challenges. And essentially, this model is based on a thinking that the performance of a business, so for a business to perform, it needs the right combination of systems and people. And the challenge with many of our companies is we're not systematized enough, and so we rely too heavily on people, and people are going to be potentially our weakest part of the next months ahead, because people are going to be isolated, people are going to be challenged. And so what a mature business aims to do in this, and one of the opportunities in a crisis, is that we can aim to increase the level of our systematization. Apologies. We can aim to increase the level of our systematization so that we actually mature our business through this crisis. So we need to work on two things. We need to work and think about what we can do in the systems of the business, and think about what we can do with our people. And so putting those two together, those two concepts together, thresholds and variety, I think it's about identifying in the next short term the things we can do something about. A word that I've heard come up regularly, or a phrase, is what can we control versus what we cannot control. To illustrate, we went through a decision-making process as a team last week where, as some of you know, I travel quite regularly. And so we had to decide, do I continue to travel or not? And that obviously has implications about how the team and how I can do the work that I do. And for me, it went back to a question of control. What can I do something about, and where do I lose control? And for me, the concern was I put myself in a different country and get stuck or get quarantined when I return, and that would lower my level, my own personal level of control. That would reduce my own variety in a sense. And then also to understand what the thresholds are, because as we went through last week, part of the thinking was, well, what is happening? At what stage are we going to see our countries take action that removes some control from us, and how do we take proactive action in controlling and identifying the things we can do something about? One of the other challenges is this concept of decisiveness. And here the concern is always that if we do something decisive and it's the wrong thing, we'll make a mistake. The flip side is that if something isn't decisive enough, it's often difficult to know that one has made a mistake. You see, the challenge is what decisiveness does is it sets us in a direction. And at least we start taking steps, which means quite soon we can see whether those steps are leading in the right way or not. And I think there is in a sense quite a lot of putting in inverted commas forgivability in the environment right at the moment. Everybody is having to make massive decisions, and so we will all make mistakes, but we need to find our way together. And so when we make and take decisions and we act decisively, we need to monitor very quickly what the feedback or the responses to those decisions. The danger is we build a wall around ourselves and we do nothing because we think that's going to protect us. Actually, I believe that acting proactively is going to enable us to set a direction going forward. And that's one of the reasons. Part of that is understanding what the picture looks like once we have gone through this thing and once we are leaving it and we're moving away from it, and that concept of liminality. And then it is keeping in mind that we are balancing things at all times. One of the challenges of governors is that we need to balance a whole lot of different interests or different goals or different stresses. The reality is we operate at a center of a whole lot of different arrowheads, in a sense. They're all pulling us in different directions, and we're at the middle here. And some of those forces are becoming stronger than ever before, but it's about asking the question, where is our position in the center of this? What are we doing in the center to protect and preserve the position we have as a business? And some of that has to do with thinking about your brand positioning and what position do you take on these challenges based on that are integrous, are consistent, have coherence in terms of your brand position, reminding your people of what you stand for. And part of the challenge there is we may need to deepen our thinking and ask ourselves, what do we really stand for, especially when we're faced by these. And so these two key issues here, protecting and preserving, may enable us to deepen or force us to deepen our thinking around what we actually stand for. And then to counterbalance that, these two, creating and advancing, have to do with getting a clear picture of the future and where we end up, or where we want to end up, being what we see in terms of the future. What things will we see as changed, and what things will we see as going back to normal? Personally, I think the new normal is emerging in more ways than we can imagine. And so with that in mind, and I trust that's been helpful, as I want to talk through and unpack some of the practical tools, a set of practical tools that will help us navigate the blizzard. And this will also be partly an introduction to some of the topics and themes we're going to be focusing on in this series. The idea of today is to provide an overview, but also to provide something practical to take forward. And so one of the things I've been involved in for many years has been to guide teams in the process of decision making. And one of my fundamental beliefs underlying that, and we certainly want to reflect that as Sadar, is although we have experience and expertise that we can bring to the table, we believe very strongly that the team we're sitting with is probably the custodian of the solution, and they probably are the ones who've got the ideas. We can guide the thinking, but the answer ultimately lies in the room. And that's how we've built this process guide, to think through things, to help us decide and to help us to do going forward. And it starts with essentially creating focus. One of the dangers of the current environment is that there is a lot going on. Phrases I've heard are, there are lots of moving parts, there is chaos, things are happening so quickly. And so one of the ideas would be to say, well, what are the key areas we can focus on that will have the biggest impact? And which areas of the business do we need to think about? And so in doing that, we use the Sadar governance methodology to focus some of the thinking, and some of the areas we're seeing emerge as key in the way forward in terms of some of the themes to talk about. And I would say even the conversations that one has to have around a boardroom table. One of the critical ones is stakeholder engagement. There is huge uncertainty. And so as people change their views, it's important to engage actively with stakeholders. What I've even suggested companies do, and we do as a company, as Sadar, is start dating our decisions, because the challenge is you could make a decision today, which is a Wednesday, and by Friday, something has happened in the world where your decision has to change. And the problem is all of our stakeholders are doing the same things. And so part of stakeholder engagement is really asking the question, what is our impact on them and what is their influence on us? And finding ways to manage that. And so one of the webinars going forward is going to focus specifically on that. The other one, obviously, and this is almost, people would have thought I would have jumped to this first, is the whole risk management and risk governance issue. The reality is that the environment has changed significantly. Expectations have changed. And so we need to be asking the question, what new risks do we face and what are we actually going through? The challenge with both of those is those are actually both strategic concepts. And so one of the other themes I think we need to really be thinking about and keeping in tension, in a sense, is when we engage with stakeholders, what is the purpose of that? Where is that going to take us to? Imagining what network of stakeholders will we require on the other side. And the same thing with risk. The reality is risk lies. So risk is one of those interesting concepts. We often think of it as this external thing to our businesses. It's obviously both internal and external, but we think of risk management as making a decision and then acting. Well, in a sense, the decision has already been made when we have thought about our strategy and what lies between where we are now down here and up here. This is our vision or our picture of the future. And certainly our picture of the future may be going right now from a 10-year picture to a 2-year picture, but the reality is risk is in the space. And so once we've thought about that, we've got to ask ourselves, what is going to prevent us from achieving our vision in 2 years? And it's not changing the vision, it's shortening the time horizon. Because the level of detail we need to think about in the short term is far greater than it's been before, or been for a while. And so those are some of the high level areas we're going to focus on. But another tool that is really valuable in thinking about, remember here we're thinking about creating focus and thinking about what areas of the business we actually need to focus on. And it's a model called the business model canvas that some of you may have been exposed to. But essentially what the business model canvas helps us do is diagnose where we believe the biggest issues that we need to act on lie. It's a powerful tool because it gives us the business on one page. And the business consists obviously of what we do and for whom, okay? And between those two, there is the relationships and the channels. And so part of the thinking going forward would be to say, well, where are the risks in those two areas, given what we are facing? If we're a business that requires people, our customers, to walk into our stores, it's going to change the way we think about channel, all right? Because maybe that is broken for a while. If it is one that doesn't develop necessarily a longer-term relationship with clients and is fairly fragile, maybe we need to think about ways of enhancing the customer relationship. And then the back office, these three here that work together, what I call activities, assets, which is resources, people and partners, are critical areas to think about in terms of our business. And so each one of those, we need to ask the question, because that's how we create our value proposition. It's the combination of those things. And so part of the process looking forward, or some of the questions we need to ask, are where do we need to focus right now and why? What areas jump out that are obvious priorities? And that's the idea of thinking about both the governance compass and the core themes we need to think about as a board, as well as the business model canvas. And holding those two things, or those tools in tension, help us to identify an area of focus that we can think about right now. And so in your businesses, if you think about those tools, I encourage you to ask the question, where do the key areas of key priorities lie? What emerges in your thinking? Because obviously all of our revenue streams are going to be at risk, and our cost structures are dependent on our revenue streams. And so we certainly need to look at ways of reducing that and ways of at least protecting, if not increasing, our revenue streams. And every business is slightly different, and every business has slightly different areas to focus on. After we've looked at identifying an area, and part of this process would be to say, let's focus on one area first. It doesn't negate the fact that there may be a whole lot of areas in the business, but it helps us keep the main thing the main thing. The danger is we start trying to unpack everything together instead of focusing on one thing that we believe is going to be the next best thing. We can always talk about the next thing after that. But in this area, we need to, what I call, explore some depth. And the key depth element is to, once we've focused on the right area, the objective here is to really understand why this is a critical issue. Also to understand what are we currently doing in this. And so part of the questions here will start with, what have we already done in this area? How have we already tried to address the risks in this area? And will our existing framework, will our existing understanding of this change as a result of what's happened? Because some of what we're doing already may continue to work, but at a different level of effectiveness. Sometimes we need to just increase the level of thinking or the level of action in a specific area. Sometimes what we've done in the past is simply not going to be effective into the future. So we do have to understand what we've done in this area, and also ask questions. Well, what concerns us most about this? I often ask questions when I facilitate. Well, what's that 2 or 3 a.m. wake up call? And all of us have had it. We've all woken up in the middle of the night with something on our minds. Sometimes we don't know what exactly it is, but to unpack it and to ask in our teams, what's keeping you awake at night? What are you thinking about as you drive home? If you are driving home, or as you make yourself the 15th cup of coffee for the day. But what's occupying your mind? Because that's a good way to unpack the concerns. And a very good question to ask as a follow-up to all these questions, as you would have seen, is ask why. Because the why question is a digging deeper question. It helps us to unpack and to define or to hit what I call the bedrock of an issue. And in what we're going through, we need to try to get to the bedrock issues, because we need to be acting at bedrock level and not at superficial level. Superficial solutions in the crisis we're going through will not work. You see, a superficial solution in a blizzard will head us off in a direction where we'll get lost, or we won't keep an eye, we'll lose touch with our teams. And those of you who know the extent of blizzards, someone can die 10 meters away from someone else because they lose touch with the real things and with what will keep them safe. And so once we've thought about the focus area and we've dug as deep as we can in this process, we can ask ourselves, well, let's unpack some of the details. So from the bedrock, and this process isn't necessarily linear, it will go back and forward, but the detail is aimed at trying to describe the issue in as much detail as possible in order to identify, and the description and the analysis and the details will help us start putting our finger on some of the key solutions that are at hand, some of the actions we can take going forward. And if the right level of depth has been reached, you should find that the details and the solutions and the actions flow quite easily. What I often find in facilitating is if one gets stuck when one is unpacking the details, it's maybe helpful to go back to the depth and explore and ask the question, do we need to go deeper than before? And some of the questions related to this is, well, what exactly does this issue look like? Why is it, especially if someone's concerned about it, what are the aspects that concern you? What are the details that concern you? And it's often difficult because sometimes we don't have the words, but our teams together can try to describe the issue in the business. And how does this impact or affect the business? And obviously why? Because why helps us both dig. The description helps us look at the details. The why question helps us to dig. And this process of going back and forward between depth and details, and this doesn't need to take a long time. If this is done right, you can get a significant amount of thinking done in a short period of time with a team that is committed to the process. And a key question as well, which would help us throw our minds into the future, is in this area of focus where we've unpacked some depth, or we've got some depth and some details, what would it look like if it was fixed? So coming out of the other side and bringing again the liminality thinking, the threshold thinking, the transitional thinking, we're asking ourselves, well, let's try to make decisions or identify actions with the future in mind, with the end point in mind, even if that end point is only 6, 9, 12 months down the road. But that helps us move to stage 4, which is determining action. And the key area here we need to get to very quickly is start asking the question, what can we actually do about this? And that's what I want to wrap up with, in a sense, is to say, how do we do that? What are some of the questions we ask? And the outcome of obviously thinking about defining or determining and trying to rank or sort the question is we need to generate ideas. What are the things that can be done about this issue? And the reason for going deep and then going into detail is what you don't want to do in this process, in the fourth stage of determining action, is revisit too much the depth and the details. You want the unpacking to happen in stages 2 and 3 of the process. And if you do that well, you will see that the actions actually emerge. Ideas will be generated. And then what we do is we need to say, well, how do we take that list of ideas? So here we'll have a list, and it's quite useful in this stage to not to filter too strongly, but to try to exclude what is obviously, not going to work. But it's a kind of structured brainstorming where you can start a list of the feasible and the viable, and then once one has a list of things, one can create what is called an ease and impact map. And what this looks like essentially, again, to give some kind of ideas, is it's a case of going from the list. So if this is your list of things you want to do, your areas, you literally create a few columns and you say, well, what is the ease? How easy is this thing, and what is the impact of this thing? And remember, an impact, we're asking, what is the impact of this action on our ability to get through this thing? All right. It's not just impact on the business. It has to have a strategic kind of momentum or tension that pulls us into the future, because we need to look through this thing. We've got to get through the blizzard. And we believe that if we do some of this thinking, we can do that. I normally use a scale on mapping exercises of 1 to 10, so that we're basically going down the list and we're saying, well, this thing will be fairly easy, all right, and it'll have a relatively big impact on the business. This thing is really going to be difficult. This is a number 9 maybe, but the impact on the business we don't think is going to be that great. This is a 4, and the impact will be fantastic, all right. Something may come out and say, well, this is and so that's the way. And this is art and science. It's not over analytical. It's helping us to create some kind of picture when we put this onto a map. So if this is ease and this is impact, all right. So these things are easy, all right. These are hard or difficult. This is low impact. This is high impact. And once we've put some of the elements on, we've mapped a few things and we've labeled them. So, getting some detail on there, we can start asking the question, what do we do? And those who know me know that I quite like these kind of mapping tools, because they help us make decisions quite quickly. See, what we want to be doing is trying to avoid the things that are hard. All right, at this end of at the top end of the E spectrum, we want to not go there too much. We want to try to find things that are lower down here in terms of easy. We want to look for those things, but it's not very effective if we are doing things that have a low impact. So this isn't great because it's easy, but the impact is low. Where we actually want to try to be is we want to try to be here, the things that are easy and have the biggest impact. Obviously, we're not wanting to avoid hard things. So we want to be operating in this column, but here we want to be saying, well, the higher impact, but the harder things to do will take more focus. And so maybe these are things that we retain at a senior level in the business. These are things we try to delegate down to our staff or to our teams. See, these things are going to require significant more thinking, and these we'll probably need to unpack more in terms of details and explore and think about. And so what we then do once we've got this list and we've got an idea of how things lie, we can create 2 more columns. All right. One of the other columns would be what I would call an accountability column. So here we have the action. All right, we've ranked it and rated it, and so we would probably be shortening the list so that it's only the things that are in this kind of space and this kind of space, and then breaking the levels helps us to identify who's accountable. So is this a senior person, or is this management? Is this a decision maker? And so you'd start putting names on this list, and then you need to obviously, sorry, let me just, what you wanted to do in the last column here is you wanted to create by when. So I'm going to go by when. And here you need dates. You need specifics. And remember that this column is going to be based on your expected time frame. So if you expect, if this thing, this specific action, all right, is something that needs to happen in the short term, you need to put dates that are in the next 1, 2, or 3 months. If this is something that you expect to happen next, then you need to put those. And so working out the date is helpful, because it helps us to create a timeline of accountability as well. And avoid trying to do too much too soon. And that's why it's often better as well, if one thinks about it, to put shorter time frames on the things in the bottom, and then as the difficulty, the hardness of something increases, there you probably have to invest more time and effort. Obviously not exclusively, but in thinking about the process going forward, that's one of the ideas, one of the thoughts, to say, how do you actually create focus on the right things in the business? How do you explore the depth by asking the right questions? How do you then unpack the details and determine some of the actions to take with key accountabilities and key areas in the business? And so with that in mind, and I'm going to give a bit of a summary, but if you'd like to think about some of your own questions and thoughts and comments coming out of this, we're going to be going forward, and some of the areas we're going to be looking at in the next couple of weeks, as I've said, are going to be areas of stakeholder engagement. We're going to talk through how do we think about mapping stakeholders. This Friday we have a webinar on business rescue, something that is, it's a term used mainly in South Africa, but it's something that we need to think about strategically. When do we start taking actions around protecting our business? Because going forward, there is going to be this tension between how do we protect, what actions do we need to take to protect the value, and what actions do we need to make to create value in and through the crisis that we are going through. So if there are any comments or questions, it would be helpful to guide the thinking. I trust it's been valuable, and to just review is to say, well, let's take a position on what we think the next few months and possibly years are going to look like. Let's think about concepts like the bullwhip phenomenon. In our own businesses, what the timelines are in your businesses, what the dependencies are. So get a big whiteboard and put some timelines together and say, well, what do you think is going to happen? Because anticipating the future, what we would call foresight, is a critical governance responsibility, to look with the future in mind, because the decisions you make today have to be about the future. And it's describing not just the environment, but describe your business going forward. And then thinking about this in terms of the two concepts of liminality, transition, threshold. What does it look like? Again, part of the process of anticipating the future is to really think productively through what do we need to prepare ourselves for. So in approaching the threshold, the two concept, what do we need to do to go through it? And there may be some temporary measures you put in place based on how long you think this thing is going to last. And then how are you going to move from it? So what does your business need to look like on the other side of this blizzard? Because this blizzard will pass. The world has been hit by some crazy things, and this one is crazy with the capital C-R-A-Z-Y. It's big. But there is a through and there is a from that we need to keep in mind at all times. And then thinking about when you look at your business in terms of the systems you have in place, the people you have in place, you need to increase what is called the variety, is the variety of the system and the variety of the controlling mechanism, your board, your decision makers, the system you have as a company is got to handle the variety being thrown at it. And there are going to be some areas of our business that are going to be incredibly fragile in this time. There are going to be other areas of our business that will be incredibly robust and resilient, those words that we hear often. And so part of the decision-making process is to discern which are those areas that you need to act on. And so that process of thinking through, what do we focus on? What are the areas that need to maintain our focus? Because what is the next best thing to do? You can do something else after that, obviously, but what are the weak links in your chain right now? Because fix the weak links, because then you can move on to the next weak link. Then you can move on to the next weak link. And our chains are going to be tested like never before. How do we go from the focus to digging deep and really, really properly understanding the details and the why questions, or the depth of the issues, before we start to just unpack details? Because the details, the interpretation and the actions flow out of understanding the depth. And if you get stuck in the process, keep asking the why question, because the why will get you deep. Then unpack the details, as to say, what does this actually look like? What are the details of our concerns? And you want to get to things that are tangible and that are actionable on, in a sense. Because tangible things we can do something about. If it's intangible and it remains vague, it's very difficult to do something about it. Once you've got that level of detail, you will see and notice that the actions emerge. And so when we define the actions, we then need to list, and then we need to assess them. And so one of the tools, and there are many tools, but the one that I think is helpful in helping us focus is the ease and impact map. What is easy to do or difficult to do, and what is the impact of those things? You don't want to spend your time doing hard things that have little impact. We simply don't have the time. We need to be focusing on the things that are relatively easy with the highest impact, and then moving from that, as we unpack those, what we'll find is that some of the harder things to do will probably become easier, because we will have invested the time and the effort in understanding them better and in moving forward through this blizzard that we're all facing. I also say to people, and that what I've said to lots of people, is I've certainly and do believe that we'll get through this together. And so please engage with us. We're running the webinars. We are also, trying to be open to exploring opportunities in this space. There are clients we can help, and we can help take you through some of the processes. What we'll also be doing is we'll be sending through the link as a result. And I know, thanks for the comment, Louise, about the connectivity issues. One of the challenges we all have is how to remain connected when we have connectivity issues. But we'll be sending through the link to the recording. And I trust this has been valuable. Thank you so much for taking the time, making the time, and please share what we are doing with other people. This is our offering to say, well, we can help. Where we can help, let us help. Thank you again for your time. Signing off. Thanks very much.